Yellow fellas, we are back today discussing On Practice by Mao, as promised in my last podcast episode. I should not have made that promise. That was extra work for me, but here we are, and I'm a better person for it because I dove deeper into On Practice by Mao Zedong than I ever have before. On Practice by Mao Zedong is considered one of the foundational texts of Maoism, Mao Zedong thought, and it's basically his attempt at describing the scientific part of scientific socialism and Marxist-Leninism. Basically, the scientific formula of dialectical materialism, how we arrive to the right theories, how practice is the cornerstone of the Marxist process of learning. And he goes from the very, again, Marxists love doing this thing where they go from the cell to then the organ to the whole organism to then environments, right? Like you start out very, very small and very, very broad, and you get more and more specific as you build up his case. He goes from, in this text, how humanity even learns. How does a human being interact with the world and learn? And from there, he expands into how Marxism's processes are done and how Marxism's scientific formula, just like science itself has a formula, Bacon's formula, I believe it's called, where there's a hypothesis portion, and then there's an experiment portion, and then there's a conclusion portion. We all remember doing that in America for science fair projects, I'm sure. Mao explains the process of that, and the Marxist formula of scientific laws in order to find the correct conclusions is almost a little bit very similar to the scientific formula itself. And so we'll be going over all of that. So yes, On Practice was an attempt by Mao to take out the dogmatist errors that had developed the Chinese Communist movement and the CPC at that time and returned Marxism back into its original place, not as a religion, where the words of Marx and Engels remained eternal and these were gods and everything they said was absolutely right, but as a science that constantly proved itself and its correct ideas through practice. And so, just like I was saying, Bacon's method goes from hypothesis to experiment and conclusion, and there's a couple more steps in there that I'm forgetting. Forgive me, it's been a while since I've done a science fair project. Mao, in writing On Practice, wanted to return Marxism to that same scientific method and not keep it relegated, as in the eyes of dogmatists, as some religious text that completely remained theory. Marx very famously said that the philosophers hitherto have only interpreted the world. Our goal is to change it. And what Mao saw was that a lot of Marxists just wanted to keep on interpreting the world. They never wanted to practice it, prove their ideas right, learn from that practice. And so this was his sort of, you could say, manifesto against that tendency that you could see arising within the Communist Chinese Party. And it's a tendency that has arose all throughout the world. Domenico Lucerto, great Italian Marxist who has written some excellent books. He's dead now, but he wrote some excellent books in his life. In Western Marxism, which was released very recently, edited by Gabriel Rockhill, who I highly recommend that version, that English language version that just came out. He called Western Marxism a privileged book club. And by that, he meant that Western Marxism had taken this weird theoretical deviation where it stayed completely within its hypothesis phase and never went to practice and didn't even want to go to practice. That it was this full of intellectuals who were so high up on their own fumes and ass sniffing and farts that they completely wanted to just sit around and completely read Marx and act superior to everybody else without actually ever changing the world. They took that philosophers have hitherto interpreted the world quote by Marx and only stopped there and didn't ever go to our goal is to change it. And you can sort of think of the various left-com tendencies within the Western left that this falls into, pick your poison. And so, his goal was to show that Marxism is not some religious text, but one that needs experiment, that needs to learn from the experiment, and needs to draw conclusions from that experiment. It's not just something that can stay happily within hypothesis. It actually has to be practiced. Your hypothesis has to have an experiment phase, right? Exactly like that. So Mao begins the text by giving us once again a history lesson like on contradiction, though this is a much more briefer one. And he talks about how humanity has throughout history used different frameworks to observe the universe, saying that before Marxist materialism as a tool was ever used to actually examine human society, people would use means of production, social relations, class struggles to sort of figure out the world around them. And that ultimately man gains knowledge only through practice in the material world, right? Mao would say that this is the basis of man's gaining of knowledge. Man only gains knowledge through action, right? And that is the basis for all of man's action. Experimentation, learning how society works, learning how the world works around you. You know, how could you ever learn about the laws of physics without actually doing an experiment, right? How could you learn about gravity and Newton's laws without actually dropping those lead balls from the top of the Leaning Tower of Pisa, as many Italian physicists did during the Renaissance? You could have never learned about that. You know, it reminds me of a lot of Greek philosophers, ancient Greek scientists. They never experimented once. And so they made so many wrong conclusions that Western society held onto for centuries. Roman and Greek scientists, centuries, they would hold on to these ideas like human organs that didn't exist, laws of physics that just didn't make sense, because the Greeks never believed in experimentation. They only believed in thought, right? They only believed in the hypothesis part. And so humanity was stuck sort of in a pseudo dark ages. And so the basis of man's knowledge is practice, is social practice, is action within the world, within his class structure, within the means of production. That is how he learns about human society. And ultimately, as a man gets his basic needs through the means of production, because that is what the means of production ultimately aim to do. The means of production's main goal, and human society's main goal, is ultimately just to get the basic necessities of life: clothes, food, a roof over your head. And as man engages with these means of production, as he engages within these social needs, he slowly builds up his knowledge, right? And his place within the world. And so Mao here is showing you how practice is the basis of our knowledge, right? Human knowledge. And he's being very broad, but he's going to specify that in the later parts of this text into how that applies to Marxism. And I'm sure you can already sort of guess, but I'm not going to spoil it here. Man also does not completely always interact with the physical world exclusively. He also interacts with the social world, and class society itself. And throughout history, every single class society has attempted to brand different classes with certain ideas and shape man's knowledge, right? So throughout most of the ages before the Industrial Revolution and modern-day capitalism, most of man's knowledge was limited. His physical interactions with the world were small. When you were in like feudalism or before the Industrial Revolution, you were mostly stuck. And before really robust trade networks, of course there were robust trade networks, but they didn't involve like the smallest places. There were places that were sometimes completely isolated and self-sufficient, or about as self-sufficient as he could be. Man's physical interaction with the world, his practice within the world, was very limited to just his small town, a couple mile area around his house. And ruling class ideas from noblemen, from kings, from the elites really shaped his perceptions of the world and gave him wrong interpretations of the world. The class that ruled him really stamped him with weird pseudo ideas that were, mystical and not very well tied to materialism and material reality. So the Industrial Revolution and its production and its change in the means of production and how man interacted with the world would fundamentally change this and finally allow man, right, average man, to gain a wide knowledge of all of society around him, study society in a way that he had never been able to do before, human society, the world. And through this opening up of man's social knowledge, right, the scientific framework of dialectical materialism and Marxism was born. And this allowed man to arrive at correct theories. And ultimately, Mao would say that man only arrives to those correct theories when his theories can prove himself right in social practice. So if you are an anarcho-communist, if you are an anarcho-capitalist, you have to prove your theories right through social practice, through actually enacting them in the real world and then drawing conclusions from their successes, if they are successful, or their failures. And if your theories cannot prove themselves to be true within the real world, they are not correct ideas. They are false ideas. And so, Mao, in this text, when I'm saying practice, like a man actually practicing with the world, he uses the word social practice. I'll give you an example of why Mao emphasizes social practice so much, right? Because it's a little bit of a confusing concept to grasp your head around, like practice and theory, what does that mean? And, practice is the basis of all of man's knowledge. Like, that sounds crazy. So ultimately, social practice is going out and actually doing something. We can think of swimming. You could learn all you want about the best ways to do a stroke in swimming, theories of swimming. You could study the Olympics of swimming. You could study Michael Phelps and all of the Olympian swimmers. You could study the statistics about swimming. You could study the aerodynamics of swimming. You could study the physics of swimming in books, in physics videos, in documentaries, all you want. But you'll never actually yourself learn how to swim until you hop into that pool of water. And that is social practice. That is the basis of all human knowledge, which then that theoretical knowledge, the theories of swimming and the statistics about swimming and the best ways to do swimming and the facts about Michael Phelps, that social practice is where all of those theories ultimately stem from. It's a beautiful dance. You don't learn until you actually do, and then by doing, you're able to help other people learn and write down theories and write it down in text, and other people can read it, and then they are able to learn by doing and yada yada, right? So thusly, Mao would say that practice is the cornerstone of the scientific philosophy that is dialectical materialism. Not theory. And that is not to say that Mao is saying don't read theory. In fact, the exact opposite. Mao wants you to both read theory and then practice that theory and then see the ideas within that theory that are right. And through a scientific process, whittle away the ideas and the assumptions in that theory that are wrong. Because whenever Marxist theory is written, it's written through, first of all, a historical materialist lens. It's written through a study of the past, study of current economic trends, a study of past philosophies and current political trends and current economic trends and current material conditions. But it's to whittle away at assumptions that are antiquated, at assumptions that are made within a simulated simulation. A lot of the times, whenever we're practicing physics in real life versus on paper, we don't have to account for air resistance, in our physics simulations on paper. In any physics class, or your physics teacher will constantly say, forget about air resistance for now, until you, of course, you go to the higher level physics classes in college. But you're always making an assumption, right? Whenever you're doing something on paper, it's always an idealized version. And then practice helps you whittle away some of the idealized visions that don't really translate to the real world. But Mao is not saying completely rely on practice, that practice is the basis of everything. He warns against that. You need both theory and practice in order to arrive to the right ideas. both play into each other in a beautiful dialectical process. Without one, you don't have the other. Without the other, you don't have the one. And dialectical materialism is a framework specifically created by Marx and Engels to liberate the proletariat. And it hinges on practice to prove its theories right, not subjective feelings, not subjective ideas that only exist in one's head, but actions that exist in practice. Essentially, like Ben Shapiro always says, facts don't care about your feelings. You could sort of see Mao saying like, practice doesn't care about your idealism. It's the same thing. And in order to further this, I will give you the sort of formula that Mao gave in his text that he would write much later in his life. This text was written in the 30s. Mao would write, "Where do correct ideas come from?" in the 60s. And Mao also expands on a lot of his ideas from On Practice. So I'll just include this. He came up with a scientific formula that would further elaborate what he was saying about his Marxist conception of the world, saying that the basis of the Marxist conception of the world is the materialist world. The world outside of the brain is the foundation for man's thinking. The materialist world, then shapes man's ideology, right? So the world around you, the physical world around you, shapes your ideology. Your ideology doesn't shape the physical world. And that is an important distinction that differs Marxism from liberalism. Liberalism believes your ideology, what is in your brain, affects the material world, that your ideology, that's your head, what's inside your brain is the basis of all idealism, is the basis of all reality. And so, since the material world is a foundation for man's thinking, and ideology, thusly, is our best attempt at describing the material world around us and getting as close as possible as we can. It'll never be 100% correct. Nobody will ever be able to 100% study every single facet of an economy, of large socio-political movements, of the earth, of large currents, of everything going on. Our theories, our ideologies, which again are subservient to the material world around us, will always be our best attempts at describing the world around us. And this differs from liberalism. Liberalism believes that our ideology is the basis of everything, that our ideology is what ultimately changes the world and is the basis of all human knowledge and human existence. I'll highlight this with an example. The American Revolution, liberals believe, happened because George Washington was just a good guy who believed in freedom and liberty and justice for all mankind. So one day he just randomly woke up and he decided to free America from the oppressive British. But Marxists see the American Revolution as something that was rooted in the economic interests and material conditions of America, which was the native rising bourgeois class that was in its infancy within America, would have been better off separating itself from the British in terms of getting just better resources and trade allocation for itself. And so the American Revolution happened to protect the assets of the burgeoning American bourgeois and their own self-interest. And the free ideology of freedom and liberty and justice for all mankind that was espoused in the Constitution and American liberalism is just an ideology that came as an afterthought to explain all of this, to justify all of this, right? So this is the difference, right? In that liberal conception, that freedom ideology is the basis of the American Revolution. In the Marxist conception, those material conditions are the basis of the American Revolution. And so Mao says that therefore, since the material is superior, ideological thoughts are just our best way at attempting the material world around us, and that ideology's accuracies must be tested when they leap from the brain to practice, through successful or unsuccessful practice. When we practice our ideologies, we see whether or not they were actually good attempts at describing the material world around us, if they are successful or if they are not. And so just like Bacon's scientific method, the method that Mao puts in here, which I am summarizing, is material world affects ideology, right? So material world, ideology. Ideology tries to describe the material world. ideology goes into practice, that practice is successful or unsuccessful, and it changes the world or does not change the material world. And then you draw lessons that help us better hone theory from that success or failure. And we go back to that theorizing phase. So it's a circular loop. We go from theory to practice, to that practice being successful or unsuccessful. And then we learn our lessons from that practice. And then we go back to theory to better describe the material world, because we'll never be able to describe the material world 100% accurately. So we're always going back to the theory board, learning lessons from the unsuccessful and successful implementations of our theory into practice. And practice that is actually successful does fundamentally change the world, leading to all new analyses. So don't think of this as a static loop. It's a loop that also furthers itself, that keeps on moving on, because successful theory and successful practice that describes the material world then fundamentally makes changes to the material world as we go from a new economic system. Feudalism, the jump from feudalism to capitalism fundamentally changed the material conditions of human economics and means of production. And so we needed all new analyses and all new theories to deal with the capitalism question as opposed to the feudalism question. Capitalism really was, liberalism really was the answer to the feudal questions and the feudal contradictions. And so now in the age of capitalism, as it has become successful, we now need answers to the capitalism question and all of its contradictions, and that is Marxism and Marxist-Leninism in the age of imperialism, and Marxist-Leninism, Maoism, and the furthering of Marxist-Leninist thought, as Maoists so often claim. I'm not a Maoist personally, by the way, in case you believe that. Having seen all this Mao theory, I love Mao. I love Mao's theory, but I don't describe myself as a Marxist-Leninist. And maybe one day I'll talk about why I don't. So ultimately, it is only through social practice, a man going out there and actually practicing his ideas, that one arrives at an understanding of human societies, their internal contradictions, and finally, logical knowledge and conclusions about said system. And all of this logical knowledge takes all aspects of the system to make a thorough assessment of it through its contradictions, operations, nuances. And logical knowledge is very different from perceptual knowledge, which is a very surface level, very one-sided, very subjectivist interpretation of the world. You could sort of think of left comms, obviously, these left-wing tendencies that are very subjectivist and don't really have a logical knowledge that is fully enthralled within the social practice and realities of the material world, but instead a very subjectivist, hippie idealist idea. But you're going to even think of, for example, white supremacists. They don't exist within the real world, right? They have a very perceptual knowledge of the world. They're very surface level. They exist in this weird reality where white people are being outbred by migrants who are being shipped in here in this outbreeding racial replacement theory. They have not gotten a logical knowledge of the world that is well-rounded and situated with a well-rounded understanding of all the contradictions of capitalism. They have this very perceptual, subjectivist, idealist interpretation of the world where if we just get rid of minorities, we're able to create a utopia, right? And there's no class struggle, and there's no capitalism, and there's no issues within capitalism. And so they don't exist within the real world, really. And this is what happens to people who remain subjectivist and remain within a perceptual knowledge, as opposed to ideologies that do social practice and learn lessons from that social practice, taking a scientific approach to learning the right ideas of the world and learn lessons and draw lessons upon that. Now, this is not to fall into that kind of error in which we believe in practice over theory completely. Completely relying on practice and no theory leads to a completely one-sided thinking of the world also, where one is unable to completely grasp the full picture of systems and the whole picture, or even fully comprehend what he is doing through practice. So Mao would ultimately, like I said before, stress that both theory and practice about the world is ultimately the process of gaining knowledge. Without one, you cannot do the other. Without the other, you cannot do the one. And he would even say that those that only rely on practice So let's say, for example, the American Communist Party, whose whole foundation is just based on, this is the uh, only way in which the American working class can truly work. We can spread our ideas through the American working class. And, we don't really need to rely on Marxist texts, and anybody who relies on Marxist texts is an idealist, and left common and ultra, that's what so many American Communist Party people say. And they don't really have ideological underpinnings in their ideology, very loosely based on some kind of weird nationalism. Mao would say about people like that they cannot have a comprehensive view of an entire objective process, and that they lack a clear direction and long-range perspective. They are complacent over occasional success and glimpses of truth, but if such persons were to direct a revolution like the American Communist Party, they will end up leading it to a blind alley. So that really does explain what happens when you completely rely on practice over theory. So practice and theory you should really think of as a beautiful dance with each other in the system that we call dialectics, and, a beautiful ballroom dance where they are completely taking the lead and progressing humanity forward. I'm going to read another quote by Mao that I think really is important and highlights a lot of his main ideas. Quote, "In feudal society, it was impossible to know the laws of capitalist society in advance because capitalism had not yet emerged. The relevant practice was lacking. Marxism could be a product only of capitalist society. Marx, in the era of laissez-faire capitalism, could not concretely know the laws peculiar to the era of imperialism beforehand, because imperialism, that last stage of capitalism, had not yet emerged, and the relevant practice was lacking. Only Lenin and Stalin could undertake this task. Leaving aside their genius, the reason why Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Stalin could work out their theories was mainly that they took personally part in the practice of class struggle and scientific experimentation of their time. Lacking this condition, no genius could have succeeded." So in this, Marx is talking about how important it is to both look at the world around you and you theorize, but also that practice and whittling away the bad ideas from the good ideas, the wheat from the chaff, and that is that experimentation process. And you can also observe other societies and their successes and failures in the help of this scientific processes, right? You can draw lessons from past revolutions, that is historical materialism, in order to help you determine what right ideas are. That is the basis of historical materialism. I'll read you two more Mao quotes. Quote, "Only through personal participation in the practical struggle to change reality can you uncover the essence of that thing or class of things and comprehend it." So there you go. Mao is saying you have to personally practice your ideology. Otherwise, without that practice, you don't know if your ideology is right. You're just taking a shot in the dark. And quote, "If you want knowledge, you must take part in the practice of changing reality. If you want to know the taste of a pear, you must change the pear by eating it yourself," which is a beautiful metaphor. "If you want to know the structure and properties of an atom, you must make the physical and chemical experiments to change the state of that atom. If you want to know the theory and methods of revolution, you must take part in a revolution." So Mao, throughout his text, brings up historical examples of how humans have gained knowledge, and through this process, how the early industrial proletariat, which were known as Luddites, would smash machines. That was their main enemy. It wasn't the bourgeoisie. It wasn't, their tactic wasn't to form political parties. Their main tactic was just to go around and smash big industrial behemoths that were putting them out of work, right? So textile workers were being put out of work by big behemoth industrial machines that could make textiles faster than ever. But through subsequent trial and error, the proletariat eventually came to the right conclusions of political organization under the scientific banner of Marxism. Through trial and error, eventually they learned that Marxism-Leninism was the best way, and being politically organized under a vanguard party was the best way to liberate themselves. It was a trial and error process. We went from, the working class went from randomly sort of anarchistly, I don't know how to say it, but I'm fucking up the word, but anarchically smashing up machines with no organization or no ideas to a vanguard proletarian party. And you can see how through trial and error we eventually arrived to this, and that is the scientific process of dialectical materialism. And ultimately, perpetual knowledge, and perpetual knowledge is the knowledge that exists in one's mind, is the hypothesis forming part of the process and is subservient to rational knowledge being the knowledge gained through human practice. And even though the world changes and knowledge gets proved right or wrong, people completely tend to remain subjective. And this is a very human thing to do. But people continue to remain unable to comprehend new material circumstances that suddenly arise that no longer make your old analysis of the world correct anymore. Think about the classical Marxists who refuse to acknowledge that we are now in the age of imperialism. Their analyses of the world are completely antiquated and aren't relevant to anybody anymore. Of course, the basis of many of their ideas are used in Marxist-Leninism, but their analyses, no longer recognizing the new contradiction of imperialism, can't really get that far in our new world context. And Mao calls people like this diehards, people who hold on to old analyses of old situations, even though the world around them is completely different. And this is a very human thing to do. This is a very human tendency to fall into. I think everybody has a tendency like that, similar to that. And so you really have to work hard to not fall into tendencies like that. And it's very hard, but you have to be socially conscious of falling into an error like that, a subjectivist error like that. Marxist-Leninism, therefore, is ultimately scientific social practice, or physically changing the world, with it acknowledging that we will never fully get to the objective truth. We will never be fully able to understand the world around our minds. We will only be able to get as close as we can to describing it. And we will only be able to get as close as we can through trial and error. Slowly but surely chipping away new revelation through new revelation, social practice through social practice, will eventually reveal about as close to the truth as we can. And this can be both science, right? This can be, physics, chemistry, dark matter, the universe, but it can also be this world around us that I'm talking about. It could also be human societies, economic systems, right? Superstructural things like religion, banks, governments, political organizations. When I'm talking about trying to figure out the world around us, I don't only mean, and us never being able to 100% comprehend it, I don't only mean like physics and chemistry and dark matter, but I also mean human society, sociology, history, economics, physical systems, socio-political movements. It's everything. Everything exists within a materialist circumstance, including our economies and human societies themselves, means of production and our social relations to that means of production. Ultimately, in our epoch of history, in capitalism and imperialism, finding the truth and changing the objective world lies in the proletariat of the working class of humanity. It is their job to find the truth in the world. It is the bourgeoisie's job, it is the rulers of the world's job to keep us from not finding the truth of our capitalist system. And that true analysis for liberation is in Marxist-Leninism. And so it is their job to obscure us as much as possible. It is their job to lead us down weird paths as much as possible. Fascism, left communism, ultraism, weird anarchic tendencies, libertarianism are all just these deviations that are unscientific, not close to describing the truth whatsoever, completely subjectivist, not based on trial and error, and fall into these weird little holes that never will succeed in practice. And it is their job to divert us from that truth, that universal truth of the immortal science of Marxist-Leninism. May have gone a little bit too far there, but it is an immortal science that is universal. Yeah, again, might have gone too far there, but is what is. And finally, I will end this with a quote by Chairman Mao. Practice, knowledge, again practice, and then again knowledge. This form repeats itself in endless cycles, and with each cycle, the content of practice and knowledge rises to a higher level. Such is the whole of dialectical materialist theory. And with that, that is the end of our little series on practice. It was about half an hour, but this is just such a lovely little pamphlet book. You can read it in an afternoon, in about an hour or two. It's very short, but it's very deep in the depths of knowledge, and it helps really situate yourself in thinking about how to actually change the world rather than just simply interpreting it. And it really gets you out of these weird left deviations that a lot of new socialists fall into. So with that, a toodaloo, comrades. This episode of the Pokepreet Pod has been brought to you by our generous members on our Patreon. If you'd like to become one of them, go to patreon.com/thepokepreetpod. Thank you.
What the fuck? Glory to Stalin, I barely made it.